On April 14th, 1875, the Tow River returned the body of Silas McKinney to his family. Silas had been missing for 3 days. He was found in the shallows 2 miles downstream of Sinkhole Pool, fully dressed, unbattered, with no water in his lungs, meaning he had not drowned by inhalation. He had drowned by exhaustion. The river had held him underwater, alive and conscious, long enough for his body to simply stop fighting. This is the mechanism. Sinkhole Pool does not pull you under and drown you. It pulls you under, releases you, pulls you under again, releases you, in a cycle that can repeat for hours. You can breathe between submersions. You can scream. You can see the sky, but you cannot escape the current. It is not a river drowning. It is a river that plays with you until you die. The Tow River runs through the narrow valley of Mitchell County, North Carolina, carving its path along the base of the Black Mountains in the way that all mountain rivers do, not choosing its course so much as discovering it, following the path of least resistance through limestone and shale and the ancient granite bones of the Appalachians. It is a cold river, even in summer, fed by springs that emerge from deep underground, filtered through rock older than the dinosaurs. The Tow stays cold in ways that other rivers don't. Locals have always known this. The cold is part of what makes it dangerous. Cold water seizes the muscles. Cold water shortens the time a person can fight. Cold water, more than warm water, more than depth, more than current speed. Cold water is what kills. The river takes its name from a woman, or so the old people always said. The name Tow is a corruption of Estado, which was itself a corruption of a Cherokee name that referred to a woman. Some said a princess. Some said a medicine woman. Some said a young girl who drowned in the river's headwaters so long ago that the river itself absorbed her name into its identity. By the time the first European settlers pushed into Mitchell County in the late 18th century, the river was already called the Tow, already carried that whispered history, already understood by the Cherokee who had lived beside it for generations as something more than water, something more than geography, something that deserved naming after a person because it behaved like a person, with moods, with hunger, with memory. The first settlers from Virginia and the Carolinas brought their own rivers with them in their imaginations. Rivers in the Piedmont were different, wider, slower, more forgiving. A man who fell into a Piedmont river could often swim out. The Tow was not a Piedmont river. The Tow dropped 700 feet in elevation over 14 miles in its upper reaches, which meant it moved with a speed and force that the settlers from flatter country hadn't prepared for. They drowned in their first years along the river in numbers that should have taught them something. Some of what they learned they kept. Some of it they forgot, or failed to pass along, or watched washed away by the very river that had taught the lesson. By 1842, the community along the Tow River, near what would become the small settlement of Relief, had been established for roughly 40 years. There were 3 principal families by then: the Burlesons, who farmed the eastern bottomlands; the McKinneys, who ran a small mill further upstream; and the Anglins, who had come later than the others, who had pushed deeper into the valley, who had built their homestead closest to the bend in the river where the water went strange. That bend is worth describing. The Tow River, for most of its length, runs roughly northwest to southeast, but at a point approximately 2 miles east of Relief, the river is forced to turn sharply south by a wall of granite that rises abruptly from the valley floor. An intrusion of harder rock that the river has been arguing with for tens of thousands of years, and has, so far, not managed to move. This granite wall deflects the current hard to the south, and as the river makes that turn, something happens to the water that is perfectly explicable in hydrological terms and perfectly inexplicable to anyone who hasn't studied hydrology. The granite ledge that forms the southern wall of the bend extends not just above the waterline, but below it, in a shelf that projects perhaps 6 feet into the river at a depth of about 4 feet. When the tow is running at normal levels, not flood, not drought, but the ordinary middle levels of a mountain river in spring and early summer, the current flowing around the bend meets this submerged granite shelf and does what water always does when it encounters an obstacle. It recirculates. The current rolling over the shelf creates a backward turning vortex directly below and behind it, a spinning wheel of water hidden beneath the river's surface, invisible from the bank, undetectable by any ordinary observation. On the surface, the pool looks merely calm, deceptively calm, a dark mirror reflecting the sky and the hemlocks and the laurel-covered slopes of the Black Mountains. The locals called it Sinkhole Pool because of its depth, 22 feet at its deepest, unusual for a mountain river of this width, and because things that fell into it sometimes didn't come back up for a long time, and sometimes came back up somewhere else entirely. The recirculating hydraulic at the bottom of the granite shelf was not, in itself, unusual. These formations exist in rivers throughout Appalachia, throughout the world, wherever moving water meets underwater obstacles at the right speed and angle. Whitewater kayakers know them. River engineers know them. Anyone who has studied the hydraulics of moving water knows that a recirculating current can trap an object, a log, a piece of debris, a human body, in a repeating cycle that the object cannot escape by swimming against. The physics are straightforward. The surface current flows into the pool, gets deflected downward by the hydraulic, travels backward along the bottom, rises behind the shelf, and flows back into the main current in a continuous loop. Anything caught in that loop moves with it. Down, back, up, forward, down, back, up, forward, cycling endlessly until the object is either carried through by a particularly strong surge from the main current, or sinks below the recirculation zone to the river bottom, or, in the case of a human being, stops moving altogether. But this was 1842. The men who understood hydraulics in 1842 were not in Mitchell County, North Carolina. They were in universities in Edinburgh and London and Philadelphia. They were writing papers that would not be read in the Appalachian Mountains for decades, if ever. The men and women of relief knew the Tow River the way farmers know weather, not as a system to be explained, but as a reality to be navigated, with the practical wisdom of long experience and the spiritual framework of people for whom the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was not a firm boundary at all, but a permeable membrane through which meaning constantly passed. Nathaniel Anglin was 53 years old in the autumn of 1842. He was a large man, wide through the shoulders, with hands that people described as looking like they belonged to someone even larger. He had built his own homestead, had farmed the rocky bottomland beside the Tow for 20 years, had raised 4 children, had buried a wife, and had never, in all those years, been seriously afraid of the river. He respected it. He kept his children from swimming in the deep pools in high water. He did not ford it in flood, but he was not afraid of it, and the distinction between respect and fear, between caution and avoidance, was a distinction that the river would, on a morning in late October 1842, collapse entirely. He had set his fishing nets the previous evening, stretching them across the quiet pool below the granite bend in a pattern he had used for years. The net had snagged. He could see it from the bank, the way the floats bunched together where the net had caught on something below the surface, pulling the line downstream at an angle that meant it was wrapped around a submerged rock or a drowned log, the kind of snag that usually came free, with patience and the right angle of pull. He waded in at the shallow end of the pool, where the water came only to his knees, and moved toward the deeper middle, feeling the cold close around his thighs, his waist, his chest. The cold was something you learned to breathe through. You took your breath before you entered. Let the cold hit you all at once, and then your body adjusted, or you thought it adjusted, and you moved forward. His wife's sister's husband, a man named Prior Hensley, stood on the eastern bank watching. He would later describe what he saw in terms that, across the next 60 years, would be repeated by other witnesses to other deaths in Sinkhole Pool with such consistency that the descriptions began to take on the quality of ritual language. The words people reached for when they needed to describe something that their ordinary vocabulary had not prepared them for. Prior Hensley said that Nathaniel Anglin had reached the midpoint of the pool and was leaning forward to free the net when the water took him. Not a wave, not a rush of current, just a tilting, a leaning over, as if the pool had gotten hold of one of his ankles and simply pulled down. Nathaniel went under at an angle, not vertical, not like a man diving, but sideways, the way a log rolls when the water underneath it shifts. He came back up immediately. He was sputtering, reaching for his footing, and for a moment, Prior said this moment was long enough that he thought it was over, that Nathaniel had simply been pulled off balance and had recovered. For a moment he was upright, the water at his chest, his hands at the surface, his face turned toward the bank. Then the water took him again. It took him in the same direction, down and slightly east, toward the granite shelf that neither Prior Hensley nor Nathaniel Anglin nor anyone else in relief had any way of knowing was there. He came up again in roughly the same spot, this time coughing. He called out. Prior said he couldn't make out the words. He ran along the bank to find a place where he could reach Nathaniel, but the bank on the eastern side was steep there, the laurels growing right down to the water line, and he couldn't get close. He shouted that he was going to get help. Nathaniel shouted something back. Prior ran. By the time Prior returned with Nathaniel's son, James, and 2 neighbors, 20 minutes had passed. Nathaniel Anglin was still in the pool. He was weaker. They could see that from the bank. But he was still surfacing, still breathing, still fighting. The pool had him in its cycle, pulling him down to the recirculation current, spinning him backward along the submerged ledge, releasing him at the surface, pulling him down again. Each cycle took approximately 45 seconds, based on what the witnesses described. Nathaniel could breathe for perhaps 15 of those seconds before going under again. He lasted another 40 minutes. The men on the bank tried everything they could think of with what they had. They threw a rope, but Nathaniel couldn't hold it. His hands, by that point, would not close properly, the cold and the exhaustion having robbed him of his grip. They threw a log for him to hold, but the current swept it past him before he could grab it. One of the neighbors, a younger man named Cabe Buchanan, started to wade in from the western bank, but the current pushed him back, and the cold shocked him so badly he came out of the water, gasping. No one waded in from the eastern bank because the bank was too steep. No one thought to wade in and then dive down, swimming along the river bottom, passing below the recirculation zone and coming up behind Nathaniel. The idea would not have occurred to them. Every instinct said, the danger is underwater. Stay near the surface. Pull the man toward the air. The instinct was exactly wrong, and it would remain exactly wrong, and no one would understand why it was wrong for 60 more years. Nathaniel Anglin's body was found 2 days later, caught in a log jam 1.5 miles downstream. He was fully clothed. There were no signs of battering against rocks, no bruising consistent with a violent underwater struggle. He looked, one witness said, like a man who had lain down in the river on purpose and simply gone to sleep, which was in its way exactly what had happened. The body had stopped fighting, and the current had done with it what currents do with things that stop resisting. The community buried Nathaniel Anglin on a hillside above the river. He had farmed beside for 20 years. His son James spoke at the burial. The minister from the church at Relief spoke at the burial. And what the minister said, or rather, what the minister's words set in motion in the community's collective understanding of Sinkhole Pool, matters enormously to the story that follows, because the minister's explanation was coherent, internally consistent, emotionally satisfying, and completely wrong. It was wrong in a way that would cost lives for the next 60 years. The minister said that the pool was cursed. He did not use that word exactly. Ministers in 1842 were careful with their words, careful to speak within the theological framework of their faith, but the meaning was clear. He spoke of Estato, the woman the river was named for, and he spoke of the Cherokee understanding of certain waters as dwelling places of spirits. And while he was careful to frame this as the superstition of people who had not yet received the Christian gospel, the framing was thin, and everyone present understood that what he was really saying was, there is something wrong with that pool. There is something in that water that takes people, something that cannot be explained by the natural order. He blessed the pool the following Sunday. He walked to the bank with his Bible and his congregation behind him, and he read scripture over the water and prayed that God would remove whatever evil thing had made its home in Sinkhole Pool. The water ran cold and dark and completely indifferent to the prayer, as water always does, because water does not make moral choices. Water obeys physics. The pool was not evil. The pool was not cursed. The pool was a recirculating hydraulic caused by a submerged granite shelf, and it would have cycled the minister himself into the same desperate 45-second rhythm if he had waded in deep enough. But the blessing felt like something. It felt like action in the face of helplessness. It felt like naming the danger, which is the first step, even if the name is wrong, toward confronting it. And in the absence of any other framework for understanding what had happened to Nathaniel Anglin, the community accepted the minister's framework. The pool was a haunted place. You stayed away from it. You warned your children about it. You did not go near it unless you absolutely had to. And if you absolutely had to, you went with the awareness that something there was watching. For 18 years after Nathaniel Anglin's death, no one else died in Sinkhole Pool. This was not because the pool had become safe. The hydraulic beneath the granite shelf continued its endless recirculation through every season, every water level, every year. The pool was exactly as dangerous in 1843 as it had been in 1842. But fear, even misdirected fear, even fear aimed at the wrong explanation, has practical utility. The community's terror of Sinkhole Pool kept people away from it. Children were forbidden to swim near it. Adults forded the river upstream or downstream when they needed to cross, avoiding the pool. The pool's reputation did the work that understanding the physics could have done. It created avoidance behavior, which is, ultimately, the behavior that prevents drowning deaths. The problem with fear as a safety mechanism is that fear has a half-life. It fades with the generations. The people who watched Nathaniel Anglin die in that pool carried the memory in their bodies, in the physical, sick feeling that came over them when they approached the granite bend of the toe. Their children heard the story, but a story is not the same as a memory. Their grandchildren heard the story secondhand, diluted, sometimes embellished into something more supernatural and less specific. The pool became a place where the devil lived, or where Cherokee spirits lurked, or simply where bad luck gathered the way bad luck always gathered in certain spots of the landscape. The specific practical knowledge: the pool is at the granite bend, the danger is the current, the danger is invisible, the danger can hold you for hours. This specific knowledge softened into general dread, and general dread is not specific enough to keep anyone safe. The Civil War came to Mitchell County in 1861, and it came to Mitchell County specifically hard. This is something the history books don't always get right about Appalachia during the Civil War. The mountains were not solidly Confederate. Mitchell County was divided, some families choosing the Union, some the Confederacy, some trying to stay out of a war that had come to their valley uninvited. The war took the men. The men who died at Shiloh and Chickamauga and in the prison camps at Elmira, New York, and at Andersonville, Georgia. These were the men who had grown up beside the Tow River, who had absorbed the specific fears of specific places into their bodies over a lifetime. When they died, they took that knowledge with them. The knowledge was not written down. It was not recorded. It lived in people. And when the people were gone, it was gone. The generation that came of age in the years immediately after the war, the young men and women born in the 1850s and early 1860s, who had grown up during the war's disruption and came into adulthood in the Reconstruction years. This generation had inherited the ruins of the pre-war community's knowledge. They knew the pool was dangerous. They knew it by name and by reputation. But the specific, experiential terror that had kept people away had thinned, and the men who might have taught them how specifically and why precisely the pool was dangerous were dead on battlefields 1,000 miles away. In the spring of 1863, while the war was still grinding through its terrible middle years, a young man named Thomas McKinney, grandson of the McKinney, who had run the mill upstream, and thus no direct relation to Silas McKinney, whose death would open this story, though they shared the blood of that mill-running grandfather. Thomas McKinney decided to cross the Tow at Sinkhole Pool because the ford upstream was flooded. He was 17. He had heard the stories about the pool, but the stories, by 1863, had acquired the quality of legend, which is to say, they had acquired the quality of unreality, the exaggeration, the distance from verifiable truth that makes a story feel more like mythology than like something that could happen to you personally. He waded in from the eastern bank. He was carrying a sack of cornmeal on one shoulder, which is significant because it added weight, and weight compresses the body's ability to swim, and weight pulls you down. He made it to the midpoint of the pool before the hydraulic caught him. His body was found 4 days later, 2 miles downstream. He was 17 years old. He was the third person to die in Sinkhole Pool. His death would have taught the community something, would have refreshed the specific fear and the specific avoidance that had kept the pool safe for 18 years. Except that the war had so thoroughly disrupted the community's capacity for collective mourning, collective learning, collective transmission of knowledge, that the death was absorbed into the general, ongoing catastrophe of a community losing its young men at a rate that the landscape of their ordinary lives could barely process. Thomas McKinney drowned in the Tow River. Other boys were being shot in Virginia. The community grieved, but it grieved broadly, not specifically, and the specific lesson of Sinkhole Pool was not learned because there was too much other dying to learn from. After Thomas McKinney, the deaths accelerated. In 1866, a man named Garrett Burleson, great-uncle of Effie Burleson, the girl who would eventually map the hydraulic with 200 apples, Garrett Burleson crossed the pool at normal water levels and drowned in the same repeating cycle that had killed Nathaniel Anglin 24 years earlier. Witnesses said the same things. He appeared and disappeared rhythmically. He could be heard calling out between submersions. He was in the water for over an hour before going still. His death was the first post-war death in Sinkhole Pool, and it hit the Burleson family with the particular force of a tragedy that felt familiar without being specifically remembered. Garrett's widow said afterward that she had always known, that Pool was going to take someone from this family. She did not know why she knew this. She knew it the way you know things that live in your bones rather than in your mind. In 1868, a woman named Sarah Anglin, granddaughter of Nathaniel, who had been the first to die, fell into the pool while washing clothes on the eastern bank. She survived. She was the first person to survive Sinkhole Pool, and what she reported was so exactly consistent with what the witnesses had described from the outside: the cyclical pulling under, the brief surfacing, the screaming, the inability to escape by swimming toward the bank, that her account should have been definitive, should have forced the community to understand that the pool operated on a principle, that it had a mechanism, that it was doing something specific and repeatable rather than something supernatural. But survival, paradoxically, made her account less believable rather than more. If it were simply a bad current, people said, a bad current wouldn't have let her go. A bad current would have drowned her. The fact that she survived suggested that the pool had chosen not to take her, which meant the pool was making choices, which meant the pool was, in some sense, conscious. This is how folk explanation perpetuates itself, not through stubbornness or stupidity, but through the very real human need to find moral coherence in events that seem otherwise random. If Nathaniel Anglin died and Sarah Anglin survived, and if the only difference was that the pool released Sarah but kept Nathaniel, then there must be a reason the pool made different choices. The supernatural explanation provides a reason. A bad and unsatisfying reason, perhaps, but a reason. The hydrological explanation provides no reason. The hydraulic doesn't choose. It operates on physics. It kept Sarah Anglin in its cycle, and then released her for reasons that had nothing to do with Sarah Anglin's moral character. Nothing to do with Nathaniel Anglin's moral character. Nothing to do with any human quality at all. Probably a sudden surge in the main current temporarily overwhelmed the recirculation vortex and spat her out. The river didn't choose to save her. The river didn't save her at all. The river is not a moral actor. But this is a very difficult thing for human beings to accept about the world they live in. We want the world to be legible. We want catastrophe to have meaning. We want to believe that if we are good people, bad things will not happen to us, and that if we are vigilant and prayerful and respectful of the spirits of the river will not take our children. The hydraulic offers no such comfort. The hydraulic takes the good and the vigilant and the prayerful. With the same indifferent efficiency, it takes everyone else. The only safety the hydraulic allows is the safety of staying away from it entirely, or of knowing how to escape it. And this second form of safety requires a knowledge that was, in 1868, in 1870, in 1875, still 60 years away from being fully understood by anyone in Mitchell County. In 1870, a traveling circuit preacher named Josiah Watts stepped into Sinkhole Pool while crossing the river and was caught in the hydraulic for nearly 2 hours. He was saved only because a group of 6 men, alerted by his screaming and working together, managed to get 2 long hickory poles out to him simultaneously so that he could grip one in each hand and be pulled from opposite directions toward the bank. The rescue worked not because the men understood the hydraulic. They did not. But because the combined pulling force of 3 men on each pole exceeded the recirculation current's capacity to hold a single body at that particular water level. It was brute physics answering brute physics, with luck playing the role of hydrology. Josiah Watts survived. He wrote a letter to his church conference about the experience, describing it in terms that mixed the physical with the spiritual in a way that was, given his profession, entirely understandable, but given the information needs of Mitchell County, not particularly useful. He wrote about the feeling of being held by something purposeful, something that released him temporarily, as if giving him the illusion of escape before pulling him back. Something that felt, he wrote, like wrestling with an angel. Not demonic, not evil, but implacable. Something that would not be reasoned with or prayed away. Something that operated according to a logic he could feel, but not name. He was closer to the truth than he knew. The hydraulic is not demonic, and it is not divine. But it is, in its way, implacable. It operates according to a logic, the logic of fluid dynamics, the logic of water moving over an obstacle at a particular speed. And this logic cannot be prayed away, or cursed away, or fenced away, or reasoned away. It can only be understood. And understanding it, truly understanding it, requires a combination of observation patience, and the willingness to ask questions that no one has asked before. 5 years after Josiah Watts's rescue, Silas McKinney died. He was the man whose body began this story, found in the shallows 2 miles downstream, fully dressed, unbattered, the coroner's examination suggesting death by exhaustion rather than by inhalation of water. Silas had been 31 years old. He had crossed Sinkhole Pool dozens of times as a child and young man in the casual way that the young cross places their elders have warned them about, with the brash confidence of someone who has never seen the warning validated. He had crossed it in high water and low water, in summer and in autumn, alone and in company, and nothing had ever happened to him. And then, on April 11th, 1875, something happened. The water was running at a particular level. He was at a particular angle to the current. The hydraulic caught him, and the hydraulic is not impressed by previous crossings or by the confidence of the young. It simply does what physics tells it to do. He was in the water for 3 days before his body was found, which means he died within the first hours of his entrapment and spent the remaining time being carried along the river bottom and through the shallow downstream reaches until he came to rest in the log jam where the searchers found him. He had, by all evidence, fought the current for a long time. His hands, when they found him, were torn, not from the rocks, which the lack of bruising elsewhere on his body made unlikely, but from his own nails, which he had apparently driven into his palms in the sustained muscular effort of trying to stay afloat. The McKinney family's grief was the particular grief of a family that had already been diminished by the pool. The loss of Thomas McKinney in 1863 was present in the room when the family gathered to mourn Silas, a ghost loss that made the new loss feel like confirmation rather than surprise. The pool had taken Thomas, and now it had taken Silas. And what that meant, what shape the knowledge of those 2 deaths should take. The family turned over and examined from every angle in the weeks that followed. They reached, as grieving people do, for whatever framework could make the deaths meaningful. The framework they reached for was the one the community had maintained since the minister's blessing in 1842. The pool was cursed. It was haunted. It was Estato's place. And whatever Estato's spirit wanted from the people of the valley, it wanted it specifically from people who entered that pool unprepared and unaware. The McKinney family put up a wooden cross at the pool's edge, carved with Silas's name and Thomas's name, and with the warning, "Stay back. Deep water." The cross stood for 7 years before a flood took it. The cross was replaced. The replacement was taken by the next flood. The replacement of the replacement stood for 4 years before rotting through at its base. The pattern repeated itself with the regularity of the floods themselves, which came every 2 or 3 years along the toe, which was a flood-prone river, in the way that all mountain rivers are flood-prone. Their channels too narrow for the volume of water that the Black Mountains shed in heavy rain seasons. Every flood that destroyed the warning marker also, incidentally, changed the pool slightly, silting it, shifting the bottom, sometimes temporarily altering the hydraulic pattern before the river settled back into its established geometry. This led to periods of relative safety at Sinkhole Pool during and after floods, which the community noticed and attributed to the flood having washed whatever evil thing lived in the pool downstream. Then the river settled, the hydraulic reformed, and the pool was dangerous again, and the next person who entered it at the wrong angle did not know that the safety had been temporary. 3 more deaths between 1875 and 1878. A boy named Cade, 11 years old, who followed a dog into the pool. A man named Fletcher Hensley, cousin of the prior Hensley, who had watched Nathaniel Anglin die 36 years before, who was crossing the river on horseback and whose horse panicked and threw him into the deep water. The horse made it across. Fletcher did not. And a woman whose name the records have largely lost, remembered only in the handwritten register of the Relief Church as Mrs. Dellinger, wife of Jacob, drowned in sinkhole pool on June 3rd, 1877, aged approximately 40 years. She had been washing clothes on the bank, the same activity that had nearly killed Sarah Anglin 9 years before. She leaned too far and fell in, and the pool took her the way the pool took everyone who fell in at the wrong angle, purposefully, rhythmically, and without the possibility of rescue by the family members who ran to the bank and found, as the Anglin family had found in 1842, that the steep eastern bank gave them no purchase, no angle of reach, no way to get a rope or a pole to the woman cycling in the current. In the summer of 1878, a man arrived in Mitchell County who was different from anyone who had passed through the valley before, and who carried, in his mind, the technical knowledge needed to understand exactly what Sinkhole Pool was doing. He was a civil engineer named Absalom Prather, traveling through the region on behalf of a railroad company that was considering running a line through the Tow River Valley, a project that would eventually come to nothing. The railroad choosing a different route through the mountains, but that in the summer of 1878 was still in its surveying stages, and that brought Absalom Prather to Mitchell County with a level and a transit and a leather-bound notebook filled with careful measurements of the valley's topography. He was staying at the home of Reverend Charles Holtzclaw in Relief when the Dellinger boy, oldest son of the woman who had died the previous year, came to the Reverend's house to ask if the engineer might have any advice about the pool that had killed his mother. The boy was 15, old enough to frame the question precisely, young enough to still believe that there existed somewhere in the world an adult who could answer it. Absalom Prather rode out to Sinkhole Pool the following morning. He stood on the bank for 2 hours, watching the water. He waded in at the shallow upstream end and felt the bottom with his boots. He produced a piece of equipment from his saddlebag, a sealed glass bottle filled with colored liquid, weighted to float just below the surface, that he used to measure current speeds in river surveys. And he let this bottle drift into the pool from several different angles, watching where it went. What he saw confirmed what he already suspected from the pool's topography and the descriptions the Dellinger boy had given him. He explained it that evening at Reverend Holtzclaw's table, using the Reverend's bread and gravy as props. The bread as the riverbank, the gravy as the current, explaining the concept of a recirculating hydraulic with the clear, precise language of a man who was very comfortable with the technical details of his subject, and who had not spent sufficient time in the company of non-engineers to understand that clear, precise, technical language is not always the same as understandable language. He explained the shelf. He explained the recirculation. He explained the cycle, and how the cycle trapped objects of a certain buoyancy and held them in a loop. He explained why the surface current couldn't be swum against. He used the correct terminology: hydraulic, recirculating current, vortex, laminar flow. He drew a diagram in his notebook. He offered to copy the diagram onto paper they could post at the pool. He was thorough, accurate, and completely correct. And by the end of his explanation, Reverend Holtzclaw and the Dellinger boy and the two neighbors who had been invited to dinner and had stayed to listen had understood approximately 40% of what he said. What they understood: the pool was dangerous because of something underwater. There was a current that grabbed you. This current was caused by a rock shelf. You couldn't fight the current. What they did not understand: the escape. Because Absalom Prather explained the escape in the same technical language he used for everything else. And the escape, the counterintuitive act of diving down and swimming along the river bottom, passing below the recirculation zone, required, to be understood, a clear and specific understanding of why going up didn't work, which required understanding the three-dimensional geometry of the hydraulic, which required either a strong visual imagination or a physical demonstration, neither of which Absalom Prather provided. He explained it verbally. He drew a diagram. The diagram was small and precise and showed the hydraulic in cross-section with arrows indicating the water's movement. The arrows were correct. The diagram was accurate. But a small diagram of arrows in a notebook, seen once over a dinner table, does not change the deep, animal, muscular certainty of someone who has spent their entire life knowing that when you are underwater, you must swim toward the air. Absalom Prather left Mitchell County 3 days later. The railroad company decided against the Tow River Valley route in 1879. Prather's notebook, with its careful diagram of Sinkhole Pool's hydraulic geometry, ended up in a railroad company archive in Charlotte. The community of Relief was left with the memory of his dinner table explanation, which passed into local lore in the form of a slightly garbled technical concept. Something about a current that goes backwards underneath the water that added a layer of scientific-sounding language to the pool's existing reputation without actually making anyone safer. The deaths continued. Between 1878 and 1890, 4 more people died in Sinkhole Pool. A young man named Elijah Anglin, grandson of Nathaniel, the first victim, which meant the pool had now claimed 2 generations of the same family. A pair of brothers named Woody and Cleveland Dobbins, who had moved to Mitchell County from the Piedmont and who had no inherited fear of the pool at all, who treated it as simply a deep swimming hole on a hot July day in 1883 and paid for that misunderstanding with their lives. Cleveland first, Woody 10 minutes later, trying to save him, both trapped in the hydraulic simultaneously, their bodies found together downstream 2 days later. And a woman named Ora McKinney, great-aunt of the Silas McKinney, whose death began this story, who was 82 years old and had lived beside the tow her entire life, and who, in a late autumn moment of something the family could only describe as carelessness, wandered too close to the pool's edge while gathering watercress from the bank and slipped on the wet leaves. Ora McKinney's death, perhaps more than any of the others, should have told the community something important. Sinkhole Pool did not discriminate. It took the young and the old, the experienced and the naive, the Anglin family and the McKinney family and the strangers from the Piedmont who had never heard of it. It took them by the same mechanism each time. It held them in the same cycle. It released their bodies the same way, downstream, relatively intact, unbattered. The pattern was undeniable. The mechanism was consistent. What the pool did had a shape, and the shape was the same each time. And if the shape could be seen and named and mapped, truly mapped, not in the theological language of the haunted and the cursed, but in the physical language of water and current and force, then the shape could be survived. The problem was that no one in Mitchell County in 1890 had the observational framework to map it. The problem was that no one in Mitchell County had thought to use apples. Effie Burleson was born on a Wednesday in March of 1891 in the farmhouse that her family had occupied since 1830 on the eastern bottomlands above the Tow River. She was the youngest of 5 children. Her father, William Burleson, farmed corn and kept a few cattle. Her mother, Lorena Burleson, kept the house and the garden and the chickens, and raised the children with the practical, unsentimental tenderness of a mountain woman who'd grown up understanding that tenderness and practicality were not opposites, but companions. Effie was born small and stayed small, which in a household where physical labor was the primary language of daily life meant that she grew up finding other ways to be useful. And the way she found, early and naturally, and with a completeness that her mother recognized almost before Effie recognized it in herself, was watching. She watched everything. She watched the way the cattle behaved before a rainstorm, heads down, moving to the fence line on the western side of the pasture, a behavior she observed 7 times before concluding that it was a pattern and not a coincidence, and that the western fence must provide some shelter from the direction that storms came from, which she then confirmed by watching the next 8 storms track in from the northwest. She watched the way the corn grew differently in different parts of the field, taller near the creek, shorter on the slope above the spring, and she dug in both places and found that the soil near the creek was darker and softer, and she asked her father why this was, and he told her about alluvial soil, about the way floods deposited nutrients, and she filed this in the same place she filed everything else she learned. Not in a box, not compartmentalized, but in a web, where everything connected to everything else, where one observation led to another question, led to another observation in a continuous expanding network that was, though she had no name for it yet, the scientific method. Her grandmother, who the family called Granny Burleson, and who had been born in 1812 and was therefore nearly 80 years old when Effie was born, was still alive when Effie was small, and it was Granny Burleson who first gave language to what Effie was doing. Granny Burleson was a woman who had grown up in a time when the boundary between knowledge and observation was not yet policed by the distinction between formal learning and informal, between book-educated and field-educated, between the kind of knowing that got you a degree and the kind that got you through winter. She had spent 60 years observing the natural world with the focused attention of someone for whom observation was survival, watching the signs of weather and disease and soil and water, watching animals and plants and people with the same unsentimental precision, cataloging her findings not in a notebook, but in the webbed, associative architecture of a mind that had never been taught to separate what it saw from what it knew. Granny Burleson had a way of speaking about observation that stayed with Effie for the rest of her long life. She would say, "Look at a thing long enough, and it'll tell you what it is." She would say, "A question ain't worth asking unless you got a way to find the answer." She would say, "Don't trust what people tell you the river does. Go watch what the river does." This last instruction was general, philosophical, one of the dozens of pieces of practical wisdom that Granny Burleson dispensed about rivers and weather and animals and people over the years of Effie's childhood. But it lodged in Effie specifically. Go watch what the river does. Not what people say it does. Not what the preacher says it means. Not what the story says happened to Nathaniel Anglin, or to Silas McKinney, or to all the others. Go watch. Granny Burleson died in the spring of 1899 when Effie was 8 years old. 2 years before that, in 1897, when Effie was 6, her mother's brother, a man named Crockett Sams, who had married into the extended Burleson family, had died in Sinkhole Pool. Crockett Sams was the 14th person to die in the pool, by the count that Effie would eventually compile from church records, family memory, and the few newspaper accounts she could find in the county seat at Bakersville. He had been trying to retrieve a canoe that had broken loose from its mooring upstream and drifted into the pool. He had waded in to grab the canoe. The canoe had drifted just far enough into the hydraulic to be ungrabbable from the shallow bank, and he had pushed further in, and the current had taken him, and the cycle had started, and he had lasted 45 minutes before going still. Effie had not seen it happen. She was 6 years old and at home with her mother when the neighbor came to tell them. But she had seen her mother's face when the news arrived, and she had seen the quality of her mother's grief in the weeks that followed. Not the sharp, acute grief of sudden loss, but the exhausted grief of a family that has lost someone to the same place, that has taken others, that knows the mechanism of the loss, even if it doesn't know the mechanism of the pool, that feels the death as a repetition of all the previous deaths in a pattern they can see but cannot break. Effie was 6 years old, and she decided, not in the formal way that adults make decisions, not with conscious deliberation, but in the instinctive, total way that children decide things that will define them, that she was going to understand Sinkhole Pool. She did not go to the pool immediately. She was 6. She was small. She was a child who understood from Granny Burleson's teaching that you didn't ask the question before you were ready to find the answer. She spent the next year watching the river. Not the pool specifically. She didn't go near the pool alone, not yet, but the river generally. She watched it in flood and in drought, in the high clear spring when snowmelt came off the Black Mountains and turned the Toe into a roaring bronze muscle of water, in the low hazy summer when the river shrank to its bones and you could see the colored pebbles of the stream bed through 6 inches of transparent water. She watched debris drift through, logs, leaves, the occasional piece of fence or furniture lost to flooding upstream. She noticed that different objects moved differently. Heavy things moved near the bottom, or didn't move at all. Light things skimmed the surface, Medium things, the interesting things, moved at a depth that the current dictated rather than the object's own buoyancy. She was building, without knowing she was building it, the conceptual foundation she would need to understand what Absalom Prather's diagram had tried to show in 1878. Granny Burleson died the spring Effie turned 8. The loss was expected. Granny was very old and had been failing through the winter. But it still arrived with the weight that any death carries. And Effie mourned her grandmother in the way that children mourn people who have shaped them, which is to say, she mourned her most intensely in the moments of practicing what she had been taught. She would watch the river and hear Granny Burleson's voice. Look at a thing long enough, and it'll tell you what it is. She would see something unexpected in the water's behavior and feel her grandmother's absence as the specific absence of the person she would most want to tell about it. That summer, the summer after Granny Burleson died, Effie went to Sinkhole Pool for the first time. Not to swim in it, not even to get close to it. She sat on the steep eastern bank above the pool, and she watched the water for an afternoon, the way Granny Burleson had taught her to watch things. She was 8 years old, small for her age, sitting in the laurels above a pool that had killed 14 people, and she watched. What she saw first was what everyone saw when they looked at Sinkhole Pool, a calm, dark surface that reflected the hemlocks and the sky. What she saw second, after her eyes had adjusted to the light and she had been sitting still long enough that the small movements of the water became visible, the micro eddies, the surface dimples, the barely perceptible rotation was something that most people never saw because most people never sat still long enough to see it. The surface of the pool was not quite still. It was rotating. Very slowly, almost imperceptibly, the surface film of the water was moving in a clockwise direction. Leaves and small bits of debris that drifted into the pool from upstream did not simply float through. They orbited. They moved in a slow circle that tightened gradually toward the center before being pulled under, and then they might reappear at the upstream edge of the pool, and the orbit would begin again. She watched this for a long time. She watched 3 leaves come through in succession. She watched a piece of bark the size of her hand enter the pool, orbit twice, disappear, and not reappear. She watched a floating stick, long and thin, the kind of stick that stays near the surface because it's dry enough to be very buoyant. Enter the pool. Slow, orbit once very loosely near the pool's edge, and pass through into the downstream current without being pulled under. The stick passing through told her something the other observations hadn't. The pull had a boundary. Objects above a certain size could pass through without being caught. Objects below a certain size could pass through without being caught. But objects in the middle range, Effie thought of these, for reasons she couldn't have explained to anyone, as the size of a head. Objects in the middle range got caught, cycled down, sometimes disappeared for good, sometimes came back up and orbited again. This was, in embryonic form, the hypothesis that she would spend the next 3 years refining. But at 8 years old, sitting in the laurels above a pool she had been forbidden to approach, she only had the observation. She needed a method of testing it. She did not go back to the pool that summer. She spent the summer watching the river above the pool, throwing different objects in, sticks of different lengths and thicknesses, rocks of different sizes, pine cones, pieces of corn husk, and noting which ones sank, which ones floated, which ones moved at the surface, and which moved below it. She threw them in groups and watched whether they stayed together or separated. She was developing, from first principles, an understanding of buoyancy and current that the adults around her had absorbed in the practical way of people who worked beside water all their lives, as instinct rather than principle, and that the engineer Absalom Prather had learned in the formal way of trained scientists, as principle without the intuitive clarity that comes from years of unstructured watching. Effie was developing it as both. As the child of farmers who had worked this river, she had the instinct. As a student of Granny Burleson's method of deliberate, systematic observation, she had the approach. And as someone who had not yet been taught the correct answers to her questions, who had not been told what a hydraulic was, who had not been shown Prather's diagram, who had not absorbed any of the existing technical framework for understanding recirculating currents, she was free to discover what the water was doing in her own terms, at her own pace, without the cognitive limitation of already knowing the vocabulary of the answer. The year she turned 10, 1901, Effie began throwing apples. This was not an arbitrary choice. She had thought carefully, in the systematic way she thought about everything, about what object best approximated the behavior of a human body in water. A person's head, she knew, was roughly the size of a large apple. A person's density, the ratio of their body mass to their body volume, was close to the density of fresh water, which meant a person could float, but barely, which meant a person in still water would float with only a small portion of their body above the surface, like an apple that was mostly submerged with just a small cap visible. An apple, she understood from her experience of watching things in the river, would behave in the water in roughly the way a human head and torso would behave, dense enough to be pulled down by a strong current, light enough to be pushed back up by a weaker one, the right size to be caught in the middle of the hydraulic's range rather than passing above or below it. She started with 20 apples on the first day. She stood above the pool on the eastern bank, still not going down to the water's edge, still observing from the height of the steep bank. And she threw them one at a time, watching each one. She kept notes. She had a piece of paper torn from a school notebook, and she made marks in a code she had developed herself. A circle for went through, a dot for got caught and stayed caught, a circle with a dot in the center for got caught and came back up. Of the 20 apples thrown from the eastern bank, directly into the center of the pool, 14 got caught. 3 went through. 3 got caught and came back up. She went home, thought about this for several days, and came back with 20 more apples. This time, she threw from 3 different positions along the eastern bank, directly across from the pool's center, from the upstream edge of the pool, and from the downstream edge. And she noted something she hadn't expected. The position of entry mattered enormously. Apples thrown from directly across the pool's center had the highest rate of entrapment. Apples thrown from the upstream edge had the highest rate of passing through. Apples thrown from the downstream edge all got caught. She still had apples left. She walked upstream and crossed the toe at the ford above the pool, and she walked along the western bank until she was opposite the pool. She had never looked at the pool from this side before. From the western bank, the pool looked different. The granite shelf that deflected the current was visible from here, a dark ridge just below the water line near the pool's eastern edge, its shape unmistakable now that she was looking from the right angle. She threw apples from the western bank. The first one passed through cleanly. The second passed through. The third got caught for a moment. She could see it, the apple pulling below the surface, then bobbing back up, and then passed through. She threw all her remaining apples from the western bank and watched, and out of 12 apples, only 2 were trapped. 10 passed through. The western bank entry had roughly a 5-to-1 survival advantage over the eastern bank entry. She went home and thought about this for a week. Then she came back with 100 apples. She had spent a week not just thinking about her previous observations, but also interrogating them, asking herself what could explain the difference between the eastern and western bank entries. The granite shelf was on the eastern side. The shelf was what created the recirculation, which meant the hydraulic was strongest on the eastern side, weakest on the western side. If the hydraulic had a weak side, a boundary, a region where the recirculating current was too weak to catch an apple-sized object, then the weak side was the escape route. If you entered the pool from the western bank, or if you could swim to the western bank of the pool once you were in it, you had a better chance of passing through rather than cycling. But she also, in that week of thinking, began to ask herself the deeper question. The question that Absalom Prather had answered correctly in 1878, but failed to communicate. If the hydraulic was strongest near the surface and weakest deep down, because the recirculation zone was a loop that pushed outward at the surface and pulled down near the shelf, then the escape from the surface current was not to swim towards the western bank horizontally, but to swim downward below the zone of recirculation entirely, and then toward the western bank, and then up on the other side. She needed to test this. She needed to find out how the apples behaved at different depths. This required a new method. She spent 3 days working it out. She tied apples to lengths of twine at measured depths: 2 feet, 4 feet, 6 feet, 8 feet, and she lowered these weighted apple arrays into the pool from the eastern bank, where she could hang them by their twine strings from a stick held over the water. She could feel the current pulling on the twine, feel the difference in pull at different depths. At 2 feet, the pull was strongest, yanking the twine downstream and inward toward the shelf. At 4 feet, the pull was strong, but different in direction, pulling inward and somewhat backward toward the upstream end of the pool. At 6 feet, the pull was weaker still, and at 8 feet, below the ledge, below the zone of recirculation, the pull was entirely different. It was downstream, not recirculating, not backward, forward, in the direction the main current flowed. Below 8 feet, the hydraulic didn't operate. Below 8 feet, the current went through. She had found the escape route. She was 10 years old. She did not immediately tell anyone. This was not because she was secretive, or because she didn't understand the importance of what she had found. It was because she was 10 years old, and she had learned, from 10 years of watching and asking questions in a household full of adults who were busy with the endless work of farming, that the best way to have an observation taken seriously was to make sure the observation was complete before you offered it. Granny Burleson had taught her this too, though not with words. By example. Granny Burleson never announced a conclusion before she was sure of it. She watched until she was sure. Then she spoke. Effie was not yet sure. She had observed the current behavior at the surface. She had observed the current behavior at depth. She had inferred the escape mechanism, but she had not yet tested the inference with an object that traveled the escape route deliberately, an object that was drop deep, moved downstream along the bottom, and came up on the downstream side of the hydraulic. She needed to demonstrate, not just infer, that the deep route worked. The following spring, 1902, the year she turned 11, she engineered a demonstration. She made small bags out of cloth, sized to hold an apple each, and weighted with enough smooth river stones to sink the apple to a depth of approximately 8 to 10 feet. She tied a long piece of twine to each bag. She would drop the bag into the upstream end of the pool. The bag would sink to the bottom. The current below the hydraulic zone would carry it downstream along the river bottom. And when she felt the twine go slack, meaning the bag had passed through the pool and entered the slower water below it, she would pull it up. If the apple came up downstream of the pool, she had demonstrated the escape route. She did this on a morning in early May, when the river was at a normal level, and her family thought she was picking watercress on the bank. She dropped the first weighted apple bag into the upstream edge of the pool, paid out the twine, felt the bag hit bottom, felt the downstream tug, let it run, felt the current slow in the twine's tension as the bag moved into the deeper, slow water below the pool, and then pulled the twine hand over hand. The bag came up downstream of the pool. The apple was inside, slightly bruised from the rocks, but through. She dropped and pulled 6 more weighted apple bags over the next hour. All 6 came up downstream of the pool. The deep route worked. She went home and wrote everything down. What she had was, without her knowing the formal name for it, an empirical demonstration of the hydraulic structure, its surface recirculation zone, its boundaries on the western bank and at depth, and the escape route, deep and then down and then through, that the recirculating current's geometry made available. She had discovered, through systematic observation and experiment, over 3 years exactly what Absalom Prather had described at Reverend Holtzclaw's dinner table in 1878. She had discovered it without his technical vocabulary, without his engineering training, without his diagram. She had discovered it by watching apples. Now she needed to teach it. This was the problem that Absalom Prather had not solved, and it was a harder problem than it might seem, because what Effie had discovered was counterintuitive in the most extreme sense. The escape from a pool that is pulling you down is to dive deeper. Every survival instinct in the human body says the opposite. Every second of life experience in a farming community in Appalachia says the opposite. You fight toward the air. You fight toward the surface. You fight toward the sky. You do not, when something is pulling you underwater, make yourself go further underwater. This is not a lesson that can be taught with words. It has to be felt, or it has to be shown. Shown in a way that makes the counterintuitive truth undeniable, so physical and so visual and so direct that the body accepts it before the mind has time to argue. Effie was 12 years old in the autumn of 1903. She had been thinking about how to teach this lesson for 2 years. She had the observations. She had the demonstration. She had in the 100 apples she had thrown, and the 6 weighted bags she had pulled through the pool's deep channel, a method of showing rather than telling. She needed an audience. She started with children. She started with the children she knew from the one-room school at Relief, a school that held perhaps 30 students between the ages of 6 and 16, that met in a building roughly the size of a large cornfield outbuilding, heated by a single iron stove in the winter, and not at all in the summer, where one teacher named Miss Colfax taught all 30 children their letters and numbers, and whatever else she could manage with the resources a rural Mitchell County school provided. Effie was, at 12, among the oldest students at Relief School. She was not physically large or physically impressive. She was quiet in the way of people who are doing a great deal of internal processing and have learned to be still while they do it. But when she had something to say, she said it in a way that made people listen. And the thing she had to say in the autumn of 1903 was this: "I know what the pool does. I can show you." She organized it on a Saturday. She asked Miss Colfax's permission to use the school's apple stores for the demonstration. The school kept a barrel of apples in the back of the schoolhouse for the children's lunches, and Effie explained, with the careful precision of someone who had practiced the explanation, what she planned to do and why. Miss Colfax, who was herself only 22, barely 10 years older than Effie, and who had been teaching at Relief for 3 years, and who had grown up in Yancey County, just south of Mitchell, and had her own complicated relationship with the Tow River and its reputations. Miss Colfax listened to Effie's explanation and felt something she would later describe as the specific feeling of watching someone understand something that you yourself have never been able to understand. She said yes to the apples. She came to the demonstration herself. 22 children assembled on the bank above Sinkhole Pool on a Saturday morning in October 1903. The trees were turning, the sourwood going scarlet, the hickories going gold, the hemlocks still dark green against the bright sky. The Tow was running at its autumn level, lower than spring, the current visible as a gentle darkening of the water where it was fastest. The pool lay at the granite bend, dark and smooth, looking exactly as it always looked. Calm, beautiful, and perfectly opaque about what it was doing underneath. Effie stood on the western bank. She had crossed at the ford upstream and come down the western side, which she always did, because the western bank gave the clearest view of the pool's whole geometry, and because she knew by now that the western bank was the safer side from which to approach the pool. She had her apples in a sack over her shoulder. 200 apples, gathered from the school barrel, and from her family's cellar, and from 3 neighbors who had donated apples when she explained her project to them. 200 apples was a number she had calculated carefully. She needed enough to show the pattern clearly, to show not just individual apple behavior, but the systematic, repeating, predictable behavior of an entire population of apples, so that the children would see not luck or coincidence, but mechanism. She began with the eastern bank. She had arranged beforehand for an older boy named Tolly Hensley to stand on the eastern bank. The steep bank, Nathaniel Anglin's bank, the bank from which all the witnesses had stood and watched the pool take their people. And at her signal, Tolly threw apples one by one into the center of the pool. Effie stood on the western bank and called out what she observed, loud enough to be heard over the water's sound. The other 20 children were split between the two banks, watching. "Count them," Effie said. "Count how many come back up." Tolly threw 30 apples from the eastern bank, one at a time, at intervals that gave Effie time to observe each one's behavior. 12 got caught and stayed caught. 8 got caught, cycled back up, and were caught again. 7 got caught, cycled back up, and eventually passed through. 3 passed through without getting caught. 12 gone, Effie said. 8 still cycling. 7 came through. 3 went through straight. The children counted on their fingers. Now watch from this side. From the western bank, Effie threw apples herself. 30 apples. Same spacing, same part of the pool. 4 got caught. 2 got caught and came back up, then passed through. 24 went through clean. The children saw the difference immediately. They could see it without anyone explaining it. The visual difference between throwing from the eastern bank and throwing from the western bank was dramatic. From the east, the pool ate apples. From the west, the pool let apples through. The children began talking before Effie had finished throwing, pointing, asking questions, arguing with each other about what they were seeing. This was exactly what she wanted. She wanted the observation to be obvious. She wanted it to be undeniable. She wanted it to be theirs. The children's knowledge, earned by watching, not received by instruction. "Why does the west side go through?" a boy named Luther asked. He was 9, the youngest in the group, and he asked questions the way 9-year-old boys ask questions, directly, impatiently, with the certainty that an answer existed and should be provided immediately. "Because the pull is under the east bank," Effie said. "The rock shelf is on the east side. The pull is under the rock shelf. The west bank isn't over the rock shelf, so the pull doesn't reach as far." She paused. She picked up an apple. "Now, I need you to watch something else. Watch what happens when an apple goes deep." She produced one of her cloth bags. She had made 12 of them, filled with stones, each one holding an apple and sized to sink to the bottom. She lowered the first bag over the western bank into the upstream edge of the pool, paid out the twine, felt the bottom, felt the current. The children on both banks were silent now. The bag was invisible under the dark surface of the pool. They couldn't see it. They could only see the twine, angled into the water, running slowly, very slowly, downstream. The twine kept running. 10 feet of it, 15 feet, 20. The bag was moving along the bottom of the pool, carried by the deep current that ran forward, downstream, below the recirculation zone that was trapping apples at the surface above it. Then the twine went slack. The bag had reached the slower water below the pool. Effie pulled the twine. Hand over hand, the bag came up, emerging from the water 15 feet downstream of the pool. She opened the bag and held up the apple. "It came through," she said. "The deep current goes through. The surface current goes backwards. If you go deep, deeper than you want to go, deeper than you think you should go, all the way to the bottom, the current will carry you through, not backwards." The children were quiet for a moment. Then Luther said, "So you have to go down to go through." "Yes," Effie said. "You have to go down to go through." She demonstrated the deep bag method 11 more times. She let the older children hold the twine themselves and feel the difference in current pull at different depths. She let Luther and 2 other young children throw apples from both banks until they had a physical, bodily understanding, not just a conceptual one, not just a verbal one, of the difference between the eastern entry and the western entry. She drew a map in the dirt of the western bank, showing the pool from above, marking the granite shelf, marking the recirculation zone, marking the escape corridor along the western bank and the deep channel that ran beneath the hydraulic. The map was simple. It was accurate. It was drawn by a 12-year-old girl who had never taken a class in hydrology and who had never read Absalom Prather's notebook and who had arrived at the truth of Sinkhole Pool by a method that was so basic, so direct, so intuitive that it was, in retrospect, the only method that could have worked in this place, with these people, at this time. She taught the same demonstration 3 more times that autumn. Once to the adults at Relief when Miss Colfax organized a community meeting and invited Effie to present. Once to the congregation of the church after Sunday service when Reverend Holtzclaw's successor invited her, and once to a group of travelers who had stopped at the ford upstream and whom Effie encountered on the road, and who had been planning to cross at the pool because the ford was running fast. The travelers did not cross at the pool. They waited for the ford to slow. The apple demonstration spread. Children who had watched Effie's demonstration taught their siblings at home. Parents who had attended the community meeting talked about it at the mill, at the store, at the church in the next valley over. The specific, visual, undeniable knowledge the pool traps you on the east, releases you on the west, and the deep channel goes through, traveled through Mitchell County in the way that practical, demonstrable knowledge travels through communities of people who share common dangers and common landscapes, not through newspapers, not through official channels, through conversation and imitation and demonstration, through children teaching children, parents teaching children, neighbors teaching neighbors. The kind of learning that sticks because it was felt and seen and made physical rather than merely described. The counterintuitive fact at the heart of the lesson, dive down to go through, required the most time to take hold, required the most repetition, required the most demonstrations with the weighted bags, because every adult who heard it pushed back with the same deep instinct. You go up, not down. Effie had an answer for this, and she gave it every time with the patience of someone who had spent 3 years arriving at a counterintuitive truth and who understood that the patience she had invested in finding it was the same patience required to share it. I know, she would say. I know it feels wrong. That's why people die in the pool. Not because they're doing the wrong thing, because they're doing the most natural thing, the thing your body tells you to do, and the most natural thing is wrong. The pool isn't lying to you. Your body is. This framing, your body is giving you wrong information, and knowing that is what saves you, was more powerful than any technical explanation because it acknowledged the difficulty rather than dismissing it. Absalom Prather had explained the escape mechanism correctly, but had not acknowledged that it was counterintuitive, had not given the people of Relief a way to understand why it was so hard to do the right thing in that moment of crisis. Effie gave them that understanding because she had thought hard about it from the inside, had understood it, not just intellectually, but in the specific way of a child who had spent years alone by the river, watching water move, making herself change her mind about what she saw. By the end of the autumn of 1903, every adult and most of the older children in the community around Relief understood three things about Sinkhole Pool that had not been clearly understood by anyone in 1902. The pool had a mechanism. The mechanism could be escaped, and the escape was counterintuitive. The hydraulic was still there. The granite shelf was still there. The recirculation was still running. But the practical knowledge that made the hydraulic survivable, the knowledge of the boundary, the knowledge of the escape, the knowledge of the deep channel, this practical knowledge now existed in the community in a form that could be passed on, demonstrated, felt, practiced. No one has died in Sinkhole Pool since 1903. Not because the hydraulic stopped. It is still there, still recirculating, still dangerous. But because a 12-year-old girl with 200 apples did what 60 years of prayers, fences, and engineering reports could not. She showed people what the water was doing in a language they could understand. In the years after her demonstration, Effie Burleson continued to live in Mitchell County, continued to attend school, and then, in a development that surprised no one who knew her and surprised everyone who expected something more dramatic from a girl who had solved a 60-year mystery at 12, became a school teacher. She taught at Relief School and then at a larger school in Bakersville when the county consolidated its one-room schools in the 1910s, and then she taught until she was 73, which was the year she decided her knees would no longer manage the stairs of the school building, and she retired with the particular reluctance of a person for whom work and learning and the transmission of knowledge had never felt like separate things. She taught reading and arithmetic and the geography of the mountains, which she knew from long personal observation. She taught her students to watch things, rivers, weather, animals, the behavior of soil and seed and water, with the same systematic patience she had learned from Granny Burleson and refined alone on the banks of the Tow. She taught them that questions were only as good as your method of answering them, and that the method could be simple, could be local, could be made from whatever materials the landscape provided, as long as it was honest and repeatable and designed to show you what was actually there rather than what you expected to find. And every September, every single September of her teaching career, from 1910 until her retirement, she took her students to Sinkhole Pool. It was a half-day excursion. She packed apples from her own cellar, and she brought lengths of twine, and she brought the cloth bags weighted with stones, and she brought the map she had drawn in the dirt of the western bank in October 1903, now transferred to a proper piece of paper and updated with annotations she had added over the years as her understanding of the hydraulic deepened. The map showed the pool from above, the granite shelf, the recirculation zone, the boundary on the western bank, the deep escape channel. She had added, in the years after the demonstration, a cross-section view showing the hydraulic in profile with arrows indicating the water's movement. A view that was, though she didn't know this, remarkably similar to the cross-section that Absalom Prather had drawn in his leather notebook in 1878. At the pool, she threw apples. She let the children throw apples. She showed them the eastern bank behavior and the western bank behavior. She lowered the weighted bags and let the children feel the current on the twine at different depths. She pulled the bags through and showed them the apple emerging downstream, still intact, still whole. And she explained, every time, in the language she had arrived at in 1903. The pool is not your enemy. It is a machine. And every machine has an escape route if you know where to look. The children watched the apples bob and understood. They understood it in the way the knowledge felt, in the body feels, not as an abstraction filed in the mind, but as a reality verified by the hands, the eyes, the muscles. They had held the twine. They had felt the difference between the surface pull and the deep current. They had seen the apple come through. Their bodies had accepted the counterintuitive truth in a way that no description, no diagram, no engineering explanation delivered by a stranger at a dinner table in 1878 had been able to achieve. They knew the pool the way you know a neighbor, specifically, personally, with the familiarity of someone who has observed closely and long enough to understand not just the behavior, but the reason for the behavior. Effie Burleson lived to be 91. She died in 1982 in the same Mitchell County she had been born in a house not far from the river she had spent her childhood watching. She had outlived several of the students she had taught, which happens when you teach long enough, and which carries its own particular quality of grief. She had outlived the one-room school at Relief, which closed in 1925, and the church at Relief, which burned in 1940, and most of the families whose names this story has carried. The Anglins and the McKinneys and the Hensleys and the Dobbianses and the others, scattered by the decades into different valleys, different counties, different states, the great dispersal of mountain families that the 20th century accomplished with a thoroughness that the mountains themselves had never managed. She had not outlived the river. The Tow River is still there. The Granite Bend is still there. Sinkhole Pool is still there, still calm, still dark, still reflecting the hemlocks in the sky in that particular mirroring way that deep, cold water has. The hydraulic is still there, still recirculating below the granite shelf at the same depth and the same speed, spinning its eternal patient loop, indifferent to the 60 years of prayers and fences and crosses and engineering reports that preceded its being understood. If you were to wade into Sinkhole Pool today, from the eastern bank, at the wrong angle, at the right water level, the hydraulic would take you in exactly the same cycle it took Nathaniel Anglin in 1842. But if you were a child who had grown up in Mitchell County, who had attended a school where the September tradition of apple throwing at the pool had been maintained, tradition passed from student to student, from one young teacher to the next young teacher, the way traditions sustain themselves when they are embedded in a physical practice rather than just a story. If you were such a child, your body would know something that it might never have occasion to use, but that would be there, in the muscle memory of the hands that had held the twine and felt the current, in the visual memory of the apple coming up on the downstream side, whole and unharmed. You would know that the pool is a machine. You would know the machine's mechanism. And you would know, most importantly, the thing that 60 years of community knowledge had failed to communicate and one 12-year-old's method of teaching had made undeniable. When the machine has you, the way out is down, not up. The way through is below. The escape from the surface is to leave the surface behind, to trust the deep current, to go against every instinct and let the river bottom carry you forward into the slower water into the downstream light. This is what Effie Burleson taught every September with 200 apples and a length of twine and a map she had drawn in the dirt when she was 12 years old. By the time she retired, 3 generations of Mitchell County children had watched the apples bob and understood. The river is not your enemy. It is a machine, and every machine has an escape route, if you know where to look.